Are social justice warriors crazed communist lunatics? Are conservatives evil, bigoted Nazis? Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? We usually want simple answers to these things. It makes us feel better. It helps us sleep better at night. Are we the rebels or are we Darth Vader? Are we Voldemort or are we Harry Potter? We want to know which side is the good side and which side is the bad side. That's why this conversation, to some, may be difficult. The truth seems to be somewhere in the middle. The truth is that history and life is nuanced and human beings are messy. So today we're going to be speaking to John Murawski, who's a writer for Real Clear Investigations. He writes amazing content, and he is someone who fundamentally understands that it's not that neither side is right, both sides are right, but both sides aren't completely right. So with that said, I'm Angelo Isidoro, and this is Cancel This. All right, John, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I've read a lot of your work, and it seems as though this cancel culture environment that so many of us thought existed exclusively on the university campus has now indeed graduated into the corporate world. And you've done a lot of good work on this. I mean, I was reading one of your pieces, which I'll link both the ones we're talking about below. But you describe, the fact that there are working professionals such as doctors who anonymously come forward and say, look, we're being put through these orientations about critical race theory and so on and so forth. But I guess no one wants to be public out of fear. So I guess I wanted to ask you a two-pronged question. When do you think this environment crept into the corporate world? And why are people so afraid to speak out about it?
Well, I think a lot of it just exploded this year after the George Floyd killing. And there was it was kind of something described as a perfect storm. People were homebound. People were very anxious. The Trump presidency made a lot of people very anxious. And confirmed a lot of people's anxieties and fears about white supremacy and racism, whether rightly or wrongly, but that's how people felt. You also have statistics that people weren't really looking at this data. Then it was thrown in their face that Black people are underrepresented in management jobs or STEM jobs. They're overrepresented in prisons and things like that. And all of a sudden, the whole narrative that's been thriving in certain sectors of academia suddenly made sense to a lot of people outside of academia because they had a lot of facts immediately at their disposal. They had this horrific video of George Floyd being killed, and it was being interpreted as a racially motivated killing, as a white supremacist act, and essentially is very symbolic of what the United States has been doing to Black people for 400 years. And so it's a clean story. It's a very compelling story. And there are people, and we have social media. The explosion of social media allows a lot of just people who otherwise would have been hard to organize. It's very hard to apply pressure to organizations to get them to fall in line or to comply with social programs that before not everybody would have found compelling. People would have found this stuff extremist or almost paranoid. But all of a sudden, it no longer seems paranoid or extremist to a lot of people. It seems like this is exactly what we need to do, the kind of radical measure we need to do to finally rid our society of this perpetual evil of racism and misogyny and sexism. So I think it all happened this year. I'm just giving you kind of a long-winded explanation, but it's been happening in academia for 4 or 5 decades in academia. It's been diversity and anti-bias sessions have been offered. I took them. I remember doing that in the 90s, but they changed. But then in 2018, Robin DiAngelo published her book, White Fragility, which really upped the ante on what diversity sessions look like. They're much more aggressive now, much more accusatory, and also we have the other book defining what anti-racism should look like, and that's Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so all those things have come together very recently, and they coalesce into, it's like all these tributaries feeding a stream until it becomes a roiling river. And it's the force of this river is a powerful force, and it's hard to resist. And even people who don't agree with it, which is probably a lot of people who don't agree with it, they just have to go along, because if they don't, they're going to be swept away. And they've seen what happens to people who don't go along, and there's severe public consequences. So, there's probably a minority of people who are true believers, and a wider range of people who either completely cynical about it but go along, or they think this is their hearts are in the right. The social justice people, their hearts are in the right place. They mean well, but they're really heavy-handed and ham-fisted about it in a way that's going to backfire. But I sympathize with them. There's a certain level of sympathy, and who am I to question them? All the systems and values that I had promoted my whole life don't seem to be working. George Floyd still got killed, and Trayvon Martin, and I already forgot the young woman's name who got shot.
Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, exactly. So these names are often trotted out in succession, like almost like Christian saints in the Middle Ages that people have memorized who they are, and they know their stories of suffering. And if you used to believe in a more moderate center-left program, you're sort of facing the reality that your program is a total failure. It hasn't stopped any of this stuff. And who are you now to question people who have another solution? So that's what I think is happening. And that's why I think, and the executives, I think some of them, I don't know how many of them really believe it, but they feel I need to do what I need to do, because in business, let's face it, when you work for large corporations or organizations, you play a lot of games that you don't believe in. And management plays a lot of games that they don't believe in, but everybody's playing a lot of games to get ahead. And this just seems like another game, and it's going to be around for 6 months or 12 months. And then there'll be some other game and something else, and just another hurdle for you to jump, and another hurdle for you to clear. And your goal is to get to retirement and clear as many hurdles as they throw in your way. And that's ultimately what your work product becomes, is hurdle clearing, and agreeing to be a team player. And this seems like a good cause. I mean, it's called anti-racism. It's called social justice. It's not called hurting people or destroying lives. It's called making society better. And so, when you look at it that way, it makes perfect sense that people would go along. And I think that if I wasn't in my current job where I have to focus on it and write about it, I would probably be going along with it too, because a lot of good people who I respect and I know and are smart and are really decent human beings, they are committed to anti-racism and social justice, because they think it's essential that we get this problem fixed in our society. And even if it means that repairing this problem is going to make some people uncomfortable and some people will resist, we need to go through this pain and this discomfort to make our society better. So I don't think anybody really has ill intent. I think people have good intentions, and sometimes there's some collateral damage, but better to collateral damage than doing nothing at all. It's almost like war, where you have a little bit of collateral damage. And when you think about the collateral damage, a lot of the times you're sort of looking at the people who went out and tweeted something, and you're sort of thinking, yeah, your tweet was kind of innocent, but you should have known better. Even I sometimes think that when these people get canceled, I think they shouldn't have been canceled. But isn't it better just to keep a low profile, keep your lips sealed, keep your mouth zipped? Because people are highly sensitive to these race issues right now. And this is not the time to be clever or to be throwing out contrary opinions. It's sort of like you need to know how to behave in certain situations. Let's say you're in a classroom in college, and you're in a seminar and you're debating something. Well, that's one thing. But when you're in a funeral, you don't go out and the minister is delivering his eulogy. You don't go out and say, I disagree with that. You're a little bit off. I have an alternative perspective. That's not the time. The funeral's not the time. And there's kind of a funereal atmosphere right now in our society with Black people being killed. And people feel like they're almost at a funeral. And it is not the time to be clever or to be witty or to have better ideas than Black Lives Matter. Now is the time to listen and to be polite. And I think that's what people think. It's just, and if you are out there tweeting studies or reports or your data on the cops is wrong, you're exaggerating something, or black on black crime, you're doing it at just the wrong time when people are highly sensitive to it. And even if you have the right to do it, a lot of people are going to think, you should have known better. This is just not the time to do it. So you can see all of that is coming together. And I'm trying to give you a sense of how I think people join these movements. They don't do it to hurt anyone. They really believe they're making the world a better place. And they're almost like doctors. And the doctor says, it's going to hurt a little bit when I give you this shot, but it's going to save your life. And this is it's a shot, it's a vaccination. We're vaccinating our society against racism, and people are getting vaccinated. And that little pinprick, it's just something you're going to have to put up with, but you have to sit still. You don't debate with a doctor when the vaccination is being executed or administered, right? So I think that's the general thinking there. And they become blind to, at what point does it go off the rails? At what point are you just harming people and not really helping anyone at this point? It just becomes vindictive and retaliatory, and no one's really being helped that I can see. It becomes a ritual where people all of a sudden feel trapped and they don't know how to get out of it. And that's the question: is that the line we've crossed? Now I know people who think it's awful that we're writing about cancel culture. Why aren't you focusing on racism? That's the big issue. From their perspective, the issue here is Hitler is rising to power. The Nazi jackboots are marching down the streets, and I'm complaining, or people are complaining that the social justice resistance sometimes gets a little carried away, or they're a little too shrill, and they're not playing by the right rules. And I'm like missing the forest for the trees, or people who are focusing on cancel culture are missing the forest for the trees. The forest is the systemic oppression, and the trees are the occasional excessive behavior in the name of social justice. So I think that's generally why people join along. Now, the people who are true believers, the activists, from their perspective, their view is they have you could think two mottos that I think would capture their view. One is, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And I've actually heard that. So I'm not making that up. I've actually been told that that's really the right way to view the world, is if you're not angry, if you don't feel rage, you're not paying attention. You're not seeing what's really going on. The other motto is one that I attribute to the social justice movement, but I haven't heard them say it. But I think it's my sense of what captures the mood or the ethos or the zeitgeist. And that is that moderation in the pursuit of social justice is no virtue. If you're moderate in the pursuit of social justice, you're really basically not really actively pursuing social justice. You're sort of sitting out on the sidelines. You really need to be really aggressive about this, because we're dealing with a very aggressive foe, and so you need to be aggressive in your resistance and in your liberation outlook. So that's, I think, the mindset. And so the way I think I'm presenting to you, you could see how people get caught up in it, right? You could see how people would say, I want to be part of this. I want to be on the right side of history. That's another thing you'll hear over and over again, to be on the right side of history. Yeah. And it's stated with a certain moral certitude that history has sides. And some of those sides, there's one right side and a bunch of wrong sides. And once you see things clearly, which is to say you're woke, to be woke is to see things as they are. And once you see things as they are and you're woke, you know exactly which side of history is right. And that is the side that aligns itself with social justice and anti-racism and equity. And the people who aren't doing that are either willfully evil, or just they're ill-informed, or they're misinformed, or they're somehow not seeing the whole picture. They're missing something. So, that's where we are. That's where we are as a society.
Well, it seems it's evidently not a very entirely black and white issue. I mean, you mentioned something that stuck out to me, which is the timing of challenging these ideas. I think back to the summer when George Floyd died, and I recall a number of conservatives, jumping on the issue of this man getting killed and saying, well, he was, on drugs, he had a criminal past, and they were just continuing to just push it without understanding that not only is it morally questionable in terms of timing, but it may even be strategically questionable in terms of getting your point across for whatever your point may be, that you may actually be turning people off by, the man's not even cold yet, and you're already saying, you're reading off all of his sins, right? It makes you wonder whether
the implication by saying that is George Floyd and all the black people who are shot by cops and all the black people who are pulled over for driving black and all the black people who are tailed by a security guard at the store and all the black people who are somehow have obstacles. It's sort of like blaming the victim. They're sort of they somehow did something to deserve it. We white people couldn't have really been in the wrong here. They must have done something. What is it the victim here did that kind of invited this response? That's how it comes across. Now, especially when you're so eager to do that. And I think on the social justice side, people hear that and they're appalled that somebody would say that. It's like showing up at somebody's funeral or reading somebody's obituary and say and just making snide comments. And so, yeah, there's a timing issue, but there's also a time when what happens is that George Floyd is turned into a blameless saint, and Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown, they're turned. And I don't know every individual story, but often these stories are more complicated than the way they're presented in, to be brutally honest, the New York Times or NPR. The stories they're more problematic than the public is hearing, and so at some point, someone needs to say, there's more to this story. I'll give you an example. In the Central Park situation, where both of their names were Cooper. That woman's name was Cooper, Amy Cooper, and the guy's name was Cooper, the bird watcher. And the way the story is presented is that he was doing absolutely nothing wrong, and she just called the cops on him and started saying, I'm being harassed by a black man. A black man is harassing me. But the real story is a little more complicated. The real story is that he told her to put her dog on a leash, and she refused to do it, and she was in the wrong. Her dog was supposed to be leashed, and he was technically right, although he's not really a park official. And he told her, potentially somewhat imperiously, to put her dog on a leash. And then he said to her, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to do something to you that you are not going to like. And then he reaches into his bag and pulls out snacks and feeds them to her dog. Now, he carries these snacks with him at all times when he goes to the park because he has confrontations and encounters of people all the time, and he's actually prepared for it, and he does the same thing. And so this woman, who's now isolated in a park by herself, there's no one within hearing distance, panics that someone said something that sounds like a veiled threat and is feeding something to her dog without any permission. She gave him no permission to put anything in the dog's mouth. Who knows if it's been poisoned or if it's who knows what it is. But this woman probably has thoughts racing through her head. Now, her phone call was inappropriate. I'm not going to defend her phone call. She trafficked in racial tropes. And that was, I think, she crossed a line. She was a professional person who worked in she should know how to behave. And she completely mishandled the situation. The reality of it is that they both tangled in this situation. They both behaved in a pretty, was triggering, a very sensitive issue, and people should have some sensitivity about those kinds of issues. But it's not the way it's typically presented. As this innocent guy just, tiptoeing through the tulips, and she starts calling the cops on him. He approached her. She didn't approach him. He issued commands, and he issued a veiled threat. And so she panicked, and then she overreacted and behaved, in my view, highly inappropriately. But I have even talked to professors of critical race theory, professors who are critical race theorists, and more than one thought it was wrong for her to be fired. She should have been given a chance to apologize and to learn from the experience, but to fire her was simply, was overkill. Was bringing the hammer down on a situation that could have been adjusted with some, deftness or some, what's the word I'm looking for? A softer touch, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's that one situation. And we seem to be in a situation where the rush to judgment, the moral certitude without knowing all the facts, is what prevails here is what I call the monocausal moralistic meta-narrative. The triple M, the monocausal moralistic meta-narrative. And that meta-narrative is very compelling. To some people, it's like has almost a quasi-religious significance. And it is a way of atoning for one's sins and a way of being exonerated and being expatiating for your sins, and to rejoin the ranks of humanity as a redeemed human being. And others have observed the religious, parallels. People have made, some observers have compared it to a kind of like a great awakening, like we've had in the 17th and 19th and 18th centuries. We had great awakenings in the United States, which like the moral religious fervor swept across the land. And this is something of that sort, where just millions of people are swept up in it willy-nilly, and they either are leaders in this or they go along just to prevent themselves from being crushed by the force of the impetus of this movement.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and does that answer your question?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's also seemingly true that, I feel like the crux of what you're saying is people are messy, but people have this tendency, to want an objective final answer to things. So whether it's that story with the bird, or with the black man in the park with the woman, or George Floyd, we rush to these he's a saint or he's a devil, and there's no gray area. And I wonder what it is about human beings that makes us so afraid or so averse to the nuance. I don't know if it's plain old tribalism, but it seems to me that everything you're saying is true. And there's a lot of hypocrisy when you look at, the right, which will jump on, the black guy in the park saying he did this, he deserves this, or whatever, or George Floyd. When in a sense, that prosecution, that guilty until proven innocent outlook is within itself a type of cancel culture, where you're saying, well, they deserved it because so-and-so, or it's bizarre how similar both sides are in that sense. And it makes you wonder whether it is this horseshoe where people want to jump to conclusions.
People have made that observation. Yeah, I've heard that observation many times. That the farther you get away from the center to the extremes, that there's a striking resemblance between, it's like the resemblance between the Bolsheviks and the Nazis. Like there's no good guys here. And so, what was it? I was going to say something. I forgot what you were talking. I just had a thought, but anyway, I forgot what it was. But anyway, it's the idea that people can't have a hard time with nuance and a hard time with subtlety, and there's just something, there must be something evolutionary about it. It must be beneficial to us much of the time. Sometimes, it may be a question of thinking fast versus thinking slow. When we think fast, we take shortcuts, and it's very low. The moral certitude to me is a kind of low resolution understanding of the world rather than a high resolution understanding of the world. So it requires less bandwidth, it requires less energy, but it's much more gratifying in some ways because everything fits together and there's nothing messy. And the high resolution understanding of the world just requires it's very inefficient. It's like energy inefficient. It's it's just energy inefficiency, in its perfect form. It just takes a huge amount. You have to read a lot of articles and you have to spend a lot of time. Most people are just too busy. They have other things going on, and they need, they can't spend this is, I mean, it's kind of what I do for a living. So as the articles pop up on my screen, I'll read them. But other people are doing other things. They may be a nurse. They may not even be on a screen when they're working. They may be engineers, they may be nurses, they may be doctors, they may be driving a truck. They don't really have that much time to sort through the messiness of the world, and they need someone to help them make sense of it. And so these shortcuts become necessary. I guess it's the evolutionary thing I was talking about. The shortcuts become necessary to process a huge amount of information that, you're drinking out of a fire hose, and you need to make some kind of sense of it. And you create a kind of template in your mind as to how to process this. And that template then is your ideology. It's your worldview that tells you which data belongs where and which data you can discount as kind of background noise and which data is really important, and how to interpret it, and then all of a sudden it's very smooth, very efficient, and then you can go back to living your life, which is dealing with your kid who's struggling in school, or your wife who's having a health problem, or your dad who's is retired and on a fixed income, or a friend's got COVID and they're struggling, or everybody's, if you don't have your own problems, then other people have problems, and they are draining, and they take a lot. Life is hard. Life takes a lot of energy and time, and it's hard. And people, they can't just spend endless amounts of time sorting out other people's problems. So we just create what I would call shortcuts. They usually work. They work because they're efficient most of the time. And in this case, they seem to work as well because they seem to confirm the history of the United States, which has a dark side, especially as regards the treatment of Black people. And it's easy to believe that what happened to George Floyd is a natural extension and continuation of what has happened to Black people for 400 years, right? It doesn't take a lot of mental energy to make that connection. It seems almost self-evident, and so people we'll say, that there's just a continuity of history. This is the same country it was 50 years ago and 100 years ago. Not all that much has changed. And then you have this, and before long, you have a perspective and a narrative. Becomes the monocausal, moralistic meta narrative that helps you interpret everything, even if it, But in real life, when you're up close to a moment, in real life, it's much messier than it is looking in history. Once things recede in the rearview mirror, they just seem to make so much sense. You can tell the peaks and valleys because you have a lot of perspective. But when you're in the valleys and in the peaks, you have a completely different perspective. And it's much harder to tell what's up and down and what's right or wrong. You actually have to think through, and you don't really know what the right side of history is. Or it's not as clear as it is once all those issues are resolved and they're 50 years in the past or 100 years in the past. But here's the thing that's important to keep in mind. History was just as messy in the past as it is now. And if you delve deeply into history, into 1865 or 1776 or 1861, you will see that the decisions that people have to make were not self-evident. They were very people conflicted. It wasn't as self-evident to them as it is to us now what they should do, because they were in the heat of the moment, and they were drinking from a fire hose, just like we're drinking from a fire hose, and they were overwhelmed of information, and the interpretations, you could see different sides. It wasn't as evident as, slavery, it seems self-evident to us how we should think about slavery, but I think it might have been a little bit less self-evident to people 150 years ago when slavery had been a norm in society for thousands of years. So we were just entering a kind of consciousness that slavery was wrong, and it was a very new worldview. There was a time when abolitionism was as radically new as transgender rights are today. It was something so new that it would require. It wasn't a majority view. It was a very cutting edge view, and in the end, the anti-slavery view prevailed, but there were a lot of new views at the time, and many of them didn't prevail, and we just have forgotten them. But when people were living at the time, they had to choose all sorts of emerging views, and eventually they chose anti-slavery, and they chose free markets, and they chose other things, but it took a long time for it to happen. It doesn't happen overnight. These things take centuries to play out, unless you have a revolution. And sometimes, we do need a revolution to make social change. It's just there's going to be no other way around it. And the social justice movement is a revolutionary movement in the sense that they're saying to us, they're pleading with us, really, we cannot wait another 50 years or 100 years for incremental change. It's been too long. It's too long delayed, and the change has to happen soon. And people who've been oppressed deserve it, and they deserve no other answer except social change and equity. And it's not. I think that I don't blame people for believing it, because I also am sympathetic to the argument, except I'm also wary of what happens when you go too far with moral certitude, and you can have disastrous results. And I'm also wary of that. And so, the right side of history was anti-slavery, and the right side of history was civil rights. But there is a wrong side of history too, and that was the guillotine in France, and that was the Gulag Archipelago in Russia, and that was the killing fields of Cambodia, and the Cultural Revolution of China. And those are all social justice movements that went too far. So it is possible to make a mistake, and it is, I think, meritorious to sometimes step back and reflect on what people are doing. Because, and to end this thought, as Friedrich Nietzsche said, those who fight monsters often become monsters. And that's really the question that we're dealing with.
And I can tell you, John, I just know right now, as some people listening to this are going to be saying, so what is this guy saying? What does he believe? Are we the bad guys? Or are they the bad guys? Or we need to know. The answer is clearly, it's not simple. And we can't have this moral certitude, even when applied to history. In Canada, John, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, has turned into a massively controversial figure because, like many men of his time, he had policies that seemingly oppressed Aboriginal people or Native people. But at the same time, he founded the country, built the railroad that united the country, made it into what it is.
Yeah.
So you struggle with this historical moral certitude, and so many people have this idea that, well, if I was back then, I wouldn't be for slavery, or I wouldn't be the Gulag guard or the Auschwitz. I'm too more.
That's the certitude.
That's the certitude.
Yeah, that's the essence of the certitude, is that if I were back then, I would have been an abolitionist. I would have been a freedom rider. I would have been running the Underground Railroad. And here, I think it was Chloe and it wasn't Chloe Val. So there was somebody who posted a tweet that kind of stuck with me. And the tweet is, if you think that you would have been a dissenter then, think about where you are now, because right now you are riding the wave of massive conformity if you're with social justice. And if you're riding the wave of massive conformity now, why not assume that you would have been riding the wave of massive conformity then? And so the dissenters today are the people who are just asking, I would say maybe myself, but I don't want to don a halo for public display. I just think that the dissenting view is the heterodox view today, the politically independent view that says that life is a little more complicated, and we need to reflect upon what we're doing and if this is the right way. And when we are baring our teeth and pounding on our keyboard and without knowing all the facts, and we feel that kind of adrenaline rush that's taking over our primordial brain, then we might want to question as to whether we are acting like rational human beings, and if that's really the right way to go. And I think all people would agree with the general statement I'm just saying. It's just that people think that sometimes extreme measures are necessary to fight extreme injustice.
And like you said earlier.
And I don't agree. I don't disagree with that.
There are moments where that is necessary, but as you said earlier, there's also the group of people who are blue-collar workers or white-collar workers, or they have families and they come home from their 9-to-5 job and they don't have time to sift through hours and hours of historical philosophies and context. And I think that's why what you're doing is so important, and truly what good journalists all around are doing is important, because you are, you're delved into this. We have the luxury of spending, our day-to-day life delving into this and creating a short, cohesive message for people to read and understand the world is more complicated. So with that said, I don't want to take too much of your time here, so I wanted to thank you for coming on. And where could people read some more of your content? In Real Clear Investigations, right?
Yeah, realclearinvestigations.com is our homepage, or you can Google me, John Murawski, JohnMurawski, and Real Clear Investigations, and you should come up with links to my stories. And generally what I've been covering is the migration of social justice ideas or social justice ideology from academia into broader society. That includes K through 12 schools, the workplace, corporate America, primarily, but it's more than that. It's also in churches, except it's hard to get into a church unless you belong to a church. And it's at the dinner table. I know of families where the parents and the children are debating and even shouting matches, just raising it's not a quiet discussion over issues of trans rights and Black Lives Matter. So it's happening in people's homes. It's happening. The classic example, of course, is Thanksgiving dinner, when all these relatives come together and get into a fight. But I think it's families are dealing with it, and the young generation. It's somewhat similar to what happened with the baby boomers when the baby boomers were schooling the greatest generation, right, about the Civil War. About civil rights and the Vietnam War and women's rights. And now we have, I guess it's millennials and Gen Xers schooling baby boomers in the same way. And there was radicalism then, and there's radicalism now. And eventually, we have a regression to the mean, and the pendulum kind of swung back in the middle. And presumably something like that will happen now. But usually what happens in these situations is that there is a shift in policy. So in the 20th century, we had two periods of time, periods of American history when there was extreme radical leftist pressure put on the United States to correct what was then, corporate monopolies, labor abuses, and other real social problems. And we as a society responded at first with the New Deal, and then we responded with the Great Society programs. So twice we responded with legislative social programs to reform our society. And I think we're at a similar inflection point right now. And the question, and we have Joe Biden's in office, and the question is, can he deliver some kind of program that will address these issues, or will it cause further, or will he overplay his card, or overplay his hand, I should say, right? Will he overplay his hand, or will the Democrats overplay their hand, or will we simply, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, basically fall into social conflict. It's just for which there's no possible reconciliation, and the outcome isn't clear. But I think we're in a very similar situation. It's a kind of situation that conservatives saw as a Red Scare, and that was happening in the 20s and 30s, and it was happening in the 50s and 60s. But we responded with legislative solutions because there were real social problems. But at the same time, the Supreme Court last year took a major step and issued a ruling which brought in gay LGBTQ people into the fold of protected classes. And so now it is illegal to discriminate against LGBTQ people in the workplace. And that, to me, is one of those kinds of policy advances or policy decisions that addresses some of these kinds of concerns. But I think that the demands from progressives are going to be hard down to equity, which Ibram X. Kendi, the professor at Boston University, describes as, he says that the only way to address past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only way to address present discrimination is future discrimination. And what by discrimination, he means discrimination against those in power, and those would be white males. And I think that is going to be a tall order. And the other demand is reparations, which typically would include cash payments to Black people. And I think that would be, I'm not sure you could get majority support for that in this country for both of those. So that's kind of what the demands are. That's what the expectations are from the social justice movement. And I don't know how as a society we can meet those demands in a way that are satisfying to a majority of the population.
Well, certainly time will tell. Time will tell, John. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
That was John Murawski. You can find his content at realclearinvestigations.com. What did you think? I found it to be a really fascinating conversation. It really reminds us all that humans are messy. Nothing is clear cut. Some people mean well but make mistakes. When we look at the social justice movement, clearly many people involved want a better world, a more equal world. But at the same time, some people go too far and ruin lives of those who merely question things. And the same goes for the other side that is quick to jump on accusations of, who deserves what. It's simply not clear, and that's a hard answer to deal with, but that is probably the truth. So let me know what you thought. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, give us a good rating. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And until next time, thank you so much.